So I'm growing mushrooms, but they're not the edible kind. Today I'm going to be trying to diagnose my raised beds to figure out why I'm growing so many of these mushrooms. I'm also going to be trying to figure out why my plants are not thriving like they should in these raised beds. And I have a few ideas that might answer all of my questions. Hi friends, welcome to my garden. My name is Mina. This is Mirkwood Homestead, a channel and blog where I talk about the homesteading lifestyle and my journey to be more self-sufficient and to help you guys along the way. So I got these raised beds off of Amazon and they're pretty big. I think they're 4 foot by 8 foot, and anything that is that size, it takes a lot of soil to fill it up. And a lot of people will fill up the bottoms with stuff like sticks and logs and other things. And while I had a bunch of mulch at my disposal, you don't really want to put wood chips on the inside of a raised bed because as it decomposes, it pulls nitrogen from the soil. Now, while I thought about that, I did not think about the adverse effects that adding so much compost to a raised bed would have. So with it being such a big size, I wanted to fill it up as cheaply as possible because, let's face it, stuff is expensive. So to fill it up, the bottom half on either bed, on one of these beds, I filled it up with rotted hay, partially rotted hay and goat manure out of the goat yard from a big pile of spent hay that had been there for a while. And I knew that it wasn't fully composted. That's why I was putting it in the bottom of the bed. However, the goat manure, the goat compost, all that rotted hay was full of worms. And so I thought that it would be pretty healthy. And in my second raised bed over there, I put chicken, I don't want to call it compost because it was more like chicken dirt. It was the stuff that I got out of the chicken yard. And while I have mulch in the chicken yard, a lot of the stuff under the mulch has not decomposed yet because I don't have enough in there for it to really be decomposing. It's not quite deep enough. So as I was digging in the chicken compost, I was digging in the chicken yard, it was pretty smelly. Some of it smelled like dirt, some of it smelled like sewage. If I'm being honest, it was stagnant. It wasn't decomposing the way that it should. However, I did find quite a few worms in that too. But I figured if I put it at the very bottom of the bed, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. So I don't think that that's what hurt me. I do, however, think that what I decided to top my beds with is my issue. I went to a local department store. I went to Walmart and I found the cheapest thing that I thought would be okay, and I did not think it through all the way. What I did was I got the compost and manure, which was only $2 a bag, and I thought, yeah, that's what I'm going to get. That's what I'm going to use. It's going to be really nutrient dense and it's going to fill up my beds for cheap. But what I didn't take into consideration, while I thought about it, I thought, it looks pretty well rotted. I think we'll be okay. Maybe it wasn't fully composted, maybe it still had a lot of manure in it, and I thought that I would be able to plant directly into it and it wouldn't harm my plants. Here's the issue. In the bottom of the beds, I put compost that wasn't fully composted. On top of that, I dumped compost and manure from an unknown source. And when we brought it home and they had been stacked up, those bags were so hot. I mean, like almost burning you to the touch. And what that told me was that it was not done composting. It was still really hot. And I thought, I'm just going to fill these beds up. And I'm going to use these beds as an experiment this year. By next year, it should be rotted enough to be able to grow something pretty well. Now, as you can see, I do have plants back here, and they are not dead yet. I have peppers, and I have some melons and cucumbers. In this bed, I have some flowers, I have some okra, I have some things that I have direct seeded and things that I have transplanted. And I will show you what they look like. What is causing the mushrooms? Number one, I noticed like 2 days after I planted it, and it rained for like a week after that, I started getting these mushrooms. To put it simply, yes, the compost is what's causing the mushrooms. As that organic matter breaks down, that's what the mushrooms are feeding on. Now, are the mushrooms causing my plants problems? No. So mushrooms are extremely beneficial to the soil. They will release nutrients as they feed on that organic matter. And anytime you see mushrooms growing, you know that that soil is pretty healthy because it's got all kinds of living organisms in it. However, the presence of this many mushrooms tells me that I have a lot of stuff that has not completely broken down yet. Because since there are mushrooms growing, I know that there's still stuff in there that they're feeding on. You'll notice this if you mulch your garden really thickly. As that mulch starts to break down, you'll notice mushrooms. Now, most people will just put mulch in their walkways. I'm really enjoying having a lot of wood chips to put in my walkways. I have not put them directly on my plants because the wood chips that I got were fresh. And as we talked about before, with things that are composting, things that are still hot, wood chips that are breaking down, they can pull nitrogen out of the soil. They can burn your plants as they compost if they get too hot. So what I've been putting on my rows is just grass clippings, and it's thick enough to keep the weeds at bay for the most part. I still have to pull grass, but not as bad, and it covers the soil, so it helps hold moisture and have that protective layer that worms really like, and it feeds the soil as the grass breaks down. And the wood chips in the rows have done a really good job at keeping the weeds down. Back to our main topic. As long as these mushrooms have a food source, they will continue to appear. So what is causing the yellowing of my plants? Now, I had 2 theories, and I think I know which one it is, but I wanted to go ahead and tell you guys what the other one is in case you come across something similar and you're trying to diagnose why your plants are not growing. So theory number 1, I've put way too much compost in these beds. What happens when you use way too much compost? Well, a high concentration of certain nutrients can stop the absorption of other nutrients in your plants, so that can cause stunted plant growth. Too much compost can also really up the salinity of your soil. There can be a lot of salt content in composting manure and other plants, and it can cause something called salt toxicity. And then manure that is not fully composted has a lot of ammonia and a lot of nitrogen in it, which can literally burn your plants. If you have ever, that's why you don't want to put straight chicken manure in your garden, because it's a hot manure, which means it has a lot of nitrogen in it. So if you've ever put straight manure in your garden and you go out there and it's touching your plants and you notice that your plants look like they've literally been burnt up, well, they have. The only way to figure out if that's my issue, and I am fairly confident that that is what I'm running into. The only way to really figure out what is going on with your soil and know for sure is to do a soil test. You can go to your local extension office and get more information on testing your soil, and they might be able to help you with that. Or you can order testing kits online. My second theory. I don't want to think that this is it, but when you're buying your compost from an unknown source, you always run the risk of it being contaminated. Now, contaminated with what? Well, it can be contaminated with herbicides. There's a really loud bird. It can be contaminated with herbicides that might not necessarily have been sprayed on your compost. So how do herbicides get in your compost? Well, depending on what they were composting, they could have been composting straw or hay or vegetation that was previously sprayed with a herbicide. But normally how it gets in there is they're composting manure, and that manure could come from an animal like a cow that has eaten hay that has been sprayed with some sort of herbicide, and that herbicide can live on through the digestive system of that animal into the manure and even through the composting process, and there can still be trace amounts of herbicides in that compost that can affect your plants. So how would we know whether or not it was an herbicide? There's a couple different ways. There's all kinds of things that can make your plants turn yellow and brown. So you have to mark those off the list. You have to figure out, are your plants not thriving because there's some sort of disease, because there's some sort of pest. You test your soil. You can also get your soil tested for certain herbicides. Sometimes herbicide contamination can be pretty obvious depending on what plant you're growing. They really attack nightshades, and it can affect those by causing the leaves to curl. It can cause them to have stunted growth. So if you suspect that maybe you did get some sort of contaminated compost, which is becoming more and more common since herbicide usage is just become really mainstream and just you can't get away from it. Test your soil, and there are ways to clean the soil. It'll take a while. You can replace the soil. You can try to clean it out with certain plants. Not a super quick way, but a kind of sort of quick way to see if you're dealing with herbicides is to plant a quick growing vegetable that is affected by herbicide, like a bean. And if it comes up and dies, then it's fairly quick to die. Other things like peppers or tomatoes, they'll still grow, but they might not produce anything. They might not grow very big, and you'll just be left wondering what's wrong with your garden. But you want to mark off all the other options on your list as to what might be causing your issues, such as pests and diseases and soil. Do I think that my soil was contaminated by herbicides? Not necessarily. I don't. I want to say that it was my own fault for jumping the gun and trying to get these beds filled with something and it being too rich in hot compost. Now, as the season goes on, I'm going to watch the plants and I'm going to, see what they do and see how they act. And I am going to attempt to test this soil, which is probably just going to come back that it's way too rich. I have a bunch of seeds that I have direct sown. And then I have plants that I have transplanted. Now my transplants transplanted a lot of basil. The basil went through shock because I did not harden it off. Hardening off your plants means to take it out a few hours during the day to get it used to being outside in the elements, the sun, the wind, the weather, all of it. And I did not harden off my basil before I planted it out, and so it went through some severe shock, some severe sunburn, but it is starting to recover. Now some of those plants did burn on the bottom. My basil is starting to recover. The peppers that I transplanted, after I transplanted them, they've started to have some yellowing, some brown spots, and then the seeds that I direct sowed, okra, which is it's off to a slow start. It might be because we haven't had some super hot weather yet. We're still pretty cool into June. We're having a pretty cool start to our season. That could be a reason as to why the okra is not just absolutely taken off yet. Flowers and things that I direct seeded, they have come up, they have started to grow. They're a little bit slow. Now this right here, this is a basil plant that I transplanted, and it's actually starting to recover from the shock, and it's growing pretty well. I planted some cucumbers and some melons as well, and I noticed a little bit of browning along the outside of the leaves. Also, I planted them pretty densely, so I'm going to have to thin them out, so that could also be a reason as to why they are not thriving. However, I do think that my soil has way, way, way too much compost in it. It is my plants are struggling because of all of the organic matter that's in the soil. It's mostly compost. It hasn't completely composted into soil yet. So what can I do now? Honestly, I'm going to wait it out. I'm going to see how these beds grow. I'm not that concerned about it this year. Next year, everything should be broken down enough to where it'll be fine, and I'll just top it off with some container soil. What could I have done if it was contaminated with an herbicide? I probably would have just replaced the soil, to be honest. But if you've already filled a big space with it, there's ways that you can try to pull the toxins out. You can experiment with it. Either certain plants can pull toxins out of the soil, like sunflowers or mushrooms. So are my mushrooms negatively affecting my plants? I don't think so. They are kind of a nuisance. They will sometimes grow up and kind of push the plant and kind of stress it out a little bit. But for the most part, no, they're not bothering my plants. They're helping break down all that organic matter that is in the compost that is causing my plants to be stunted because it's too hot and because it's causing an imbalance in the nutrients. So I'm not bothered by the mushrooms. They are kind of comical to come out here and see every morning all of the different. I'm pretty sure they're all one type of mushroom, and I'm not going to say what kind because I don't know. These are not edible, by the way. You see something like this popping up in your garden, more than likely it's not going to be edible unless you particularly put some sort of mushroom spawn there to grow. These mushrooms could be coming from all of the hay and stuff that's underneath of the compost that I put in here initially, but I think it's a mixture of both. I think it's just nothing but organic matter that's being broken down. So I will give you an update throughout the season to let you know how these plants are doing. I think that my basil will be okay, and I think that some of the flowers that I direct sowed will be alright. My sunflowers seem to be doing okay. I've got some cosmos, they're growing pretty good. But the peppers have went through some shock, and my mother, she filled up a couple of her raised beds over on her property. She did it differently than I did, though. She did not use any sort of compost from here on the farm. She just went straight and got the stuff from Walmart and then topped it off with garden soil, no container soil. And her plants are all stunted. The beans have turned completely yellow. And so that was what made me concerned that maybe there might be some contamination from herbicides because of how just horribly the plants are doing over there. But I'm going to compare and see how they do. I don't know why mine are doing so much differently than hers, considering we did use the same product. The only difference is that I also used organic matter from the farm here to fill the bed most of the way up, so that could be the reason that it's so different. So if you're having problems, get your soil tested first, figure out what you're lacking in or what you have too much of, and figure out how to amend it. Just do a quick Google search. If you're still having issues, there might be some sort of test you could run to see if you've had any kind of herbicide contamination. Other than that, I mean, this is an experiment. I mean, gardening every year is something different. We have different problems that we face each season. But I hope that you found this video to be helpful in some way, or at least mildly entertaining. And if you're having any of the same issues, let me know. Mistake. I'm not going to say mistake. This was a big experiment for me. They will be really well fertilized with compost for next year, that's for sure. So be careful at how much compost you use, where you source your compost from, and let me know what you're growing and how it's doing, and I'll see you in the next video.